Chairman Book Club events. So I'm going to go ahead and begin the introductions of our wonderful panel. People who are just arriving, please feel free to just sit down and make yourselves comfortable. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. My name is Frank Hausch. I have the honor of being the chairman of the Board of Trustees for the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library System, 37 libraries serving Erie County. This is the final installment, at least for my purposes, of the Chairman's Book Club. My 3-year term, I'm term limited out, is coming to an end, and we'll see what the next chairman wishes to do. It is our hope to continue that, and we have in fact chosen a book for the beginning of next year. If we do in fact proceed with the Chairman's Book Club, it will be, for those of you who are familiar with the series, it will be guest hosted by Karen King, Executive Director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women, and she has chosen a wonderful book, but I won't announce what that is yet until we know that we're going to be continuing the series. I just want to say it's been my great pleasure to do this. The idea of the Chairman's Book Club has been to discuss important issues of the day that affect all of us locally, globally, through the use of current books and through the lens of expert panels. And I think we're going to be closing this series with what is going to be perhaps one of the best yet. I'll begin on the left. We have Jay Burney is the founder and chair of Friends of Times Beach Nature Preserve, the Habitat Chair of the Western New York Environmental Alliance, and one of the founders of the Our Outer Harbor Coalition. He created and directed the Western New York Environmental Roundtable from 1994 to 2010, which hosted the Buffalo Tree Summit and the Buffalo Pesticide Summit. He is executive director of the Pollinator Conservation Association and co-chair of the, it's a B flat, there we go, of the Niagara Greenway Pollinator Conservation Partnership, and in 2014 he was awarded the Bruce Kirschner Conservationist of the Year Award by the Sierra Niagara Group of the Sierra Club. Jim Howe is director of the Nature Conservancy's Central and Western New York chapter, where he leads a team of 20 staff working to conserve the lands and waters of a region that includes Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, the Southern Tier, the Finger Lakes, and Tug Hill. Before joining the Nature Conservancy, Jim worked at the Sonoran Institute in Tucson, and as a journalist covering state and federal environmental and land use policy on Capitol Hill. He is co-author of the book Balancing Nature and Commerce in Gateway Communities, a how-to guide designed to help communities preserve their quality of life in the face of growth and development pressures, and he is a graduate of Cornell University's Department of Natural Resources. He holds a master's degree in public policy from the University of Michigan. Jim comes to us today from Rochester, and it is our hope to continue this panel. We often, am I doing that? Am I turning in with my coat? All right, sorry. I had a high school band that brought me right back to that. I had an amplifier that never worked. He's much nicer than the sound guy in the band. He was constantly cursing me. So we're hoping to recreate this in Rochester at the Rochester Library. Finally, Jill Jedlicka, did I say that right? Is the executive director of the Buffalo Niagara Waterkeepers since 2012, and on the cover of Buffalo Spree, standing in, what water was it that you were standing in?
The Niagara River.
Niagara River. Since 2012, after serving nearly a decade as a Waterkeepers Director of Ecological Programs, and 5 years with the Erie County Department of Environment and Planning. She has, over the past 19 years, helped secure funding and implement over $100 million in federal, state, local, and private investments toward local initiatives that have contributed to the region's waterfront and economic resurgence. These projects include toxic sediment cleanup of the Buffalo River, large-scale habitat restoration, waterfront access, and water quality improvement. Under her leadership, Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper has been recognized internationally with the North American River Prize and the Thies International River Prize. She holds a BS and MBA from UB and is a Western New York native. We are going to proceed as we always have. We're going to give each of our panelists 10 minutes to talk about their impressions of the book, and the balance of the time will be for discussion. I'll start it off with Jay. Thank you.
Thanks for that nice introduction, Frank. Welcome, everyone. It's glad to see you all. It's really an honor of mine to be here with these two. These two I've described often as heroes of mine. Jill, I've known you how long? Almost 20 years, right? And Jim, I've known you about 5 years. These are great people. I'm glad they're here. We're going to have a great discussion today. This book, The Life and Death of the Great Lakes, is a really significant book, and it's important to our region. And I want to talk about why it's important to us here. I want to kind of personalize it. I want to start by talking about the Great Lakes. What are the Great Lakes? And I know, we all live next to them, so we feel them, we see them. The Great Lakes are big bodies of water. For instance, about 80% of the fresh surface water in the United States is in the Great Lakes. About 20% of the fresh surface water on the whole planet are in the Great Lakes. That's pretty important. And so we use it. And it supports and sustains us as people in a lot of different ways. Obviously, we need fresh water to live. We need it to drink. We require it to run our economies. Agriculture, industry, and recreation, so much is dependent on that fresh water. It's also used for transportation. I mean, traditionally, we wouldn't be here now if it wasn't for the Great Lakes. People got to Buffalo, and Buffalo became the hub that it became. First a huge economic hub, first a trading hub, then an economic hub, then a military hub, and now we are where we are, kind of on a fading end of the use of the lakes for the kinds of things we've always used it for. But in the use of them, industry, agriculture, drinking water, there's some conflict. Obviously, when you have agricultural runoff and other kind of sewer runoff, which we use the Great Lakes for, we use rivers and tributaries and as kind of sewers, and it all goes into pollution, and that creates havoc. And it's caused, initially, as this book suggests, the death of the Great Lakes. And now we're in a position where we can start to think about how we protect and how we conserve. We've been doing that for a while. Jill's dad was your granddad. Your great uncle was involved in the 60s and brought President Johnson to this community to talk about helping to clean up the Great Lakes. And so she's got a great family legacy of that. We still have a lot to do. We've done a lot, but the Great Lakes are in rough shape. All of our work contributes to changing that, but it's not enough. And I just want to make everyone know it's kind of a desperate situation, but it's not a hopeless situation. There's a lot of things that we can do and do. We have to. I mean, our future depends on it. This is our water. These are our lakes. And in a real sense, the public trust suggests that we own it, and we have to make sure that we continue to claim that ownership and we don't let someone else own it. For instance, industries. And people try to sell the water. And, there's all sorts of economic balance, but ultimately the responsibility for the Great Lakes belongs to us. So, we here in Western New York and Buffalo have a pretty great responsibility as stewards and as conservationists. And one of the big projects that we've been engaged with, and I'll let Jill talk about what Waterkeeper has done and Jim talk about what the Nature Conservancy has done, but our community has been really responsive to the Outer Harbor. The Outer Harbor is one of the last great, I'm going to say, undeveloped areas in our region. It was developed, it was industrial, it was polluted, it was abandoned, and now it's left out there and we're trying to think of what to do with it. About 6 or 7 years ago, the state came up with a plan to develop it. And by developing it, they were talking about what I describe as 100 blocks of condos. Very intense development that would have made the Outer Harbor look more like what the Inner Harbor looks like now. Very little public access, a lot of stuff that goes into the lake. It keeps us away from seeing the water and feeling the water and being a part of the water. And so we fought that. And as mentioned, I'm chairman of the Friends of Times Beach Nature Preserve. I've been doing that for a long time. We created that nature preserve, but when we realized that there were going to be condos that were being proposed and maybe being developed in the Outer Harbor, we jumped into action. And with a lot of partners, we fought it. We resisted, we had protests, we did media, and ultimately we created this Our Outer Harbor group to organize people to talk about what we'd rather have out there. And the public has been speaking pretty eloquently and loudly about what we want out there. We want condos and development? Not so much. Do we want recreation and access to the water? Pretty much, that's what people like. We also recognize that some people say you can't make any money unless you build out there. Well, we think that if you don't build out there, if you preserve out there, keep it green, keep it publicly accessible, keep it for recreation, keep it for nature, think about things like birds. This is the gateway to something called the Niagara River globally important bird area. That's an important designation. We have birds that come here from the Amazon, birds here that go to the Arctic, and they rely on this area. Why are birds important? They help promote biodiversity. If you think about conservation, sometimes you think, let's save the Amazon. Birds that live and breed here help protect the biodiversity of the Amazon. The outer harbor, as well as the whole Niagara River Strait, are part of that habitat. So one thing we think about is things like nature. How do we preserve nature? That's what the Times Beach Nature Preserve is about. That's what Tiff Farm is about. That's what our shoreline should be about. Currently, we have moved the state to be thinking about more things like nature and recreation rather than building and development. There's going to be some announcements in the next few months from the state about what they're doing out there, and it's going to be more to the liking of me as a conservationist. We're going to be creating shorelines that are ecologically sound. We're going to be creating recreational areas that keep people involved. You go out there, you can see sunsets, you can see the sky at night, you can see birds, you can see butterflies, you can maybe not swim. I don't know if we'll ever be able to swim in Lake Erie or not, because we still use the waters as sewers, but we're working on that. But it's going to be a place where we can enjoy and learn how to connect. Connectivity is what we have to be about, and this book is a way to think about connectivity, because it talks about how humans helped create the death of the Great Lakes and how humans are helping to bring the Great Lakes back. And so we have a great community engagement here, and I'll be glad to talk with you more about it anytime. I think my 10 minutes are almost up, and I'm very happy to tell you about this Outer Harbor stuff.
Thank you, Jay. So I'm Jim Howe. I'm the director of the Nature Conservancy in Central and Western New York. Great to be here on this panel with my colleagues, and thank the library for hosting us today too. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about some of my history in the Great Lakes, some of the things the Nature Conservancy is doing, and some of the things that struck me in this book, which is a great read. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. So the Nature Conservancy, first of all, our mission is to conserve the lands and waters on which all life depends. We like to say not just for nature, but for people too. And we're a science-based organization that works in partnership with diverse stakeholders to find solutions to environmental challenges. I think that's really our niche. I want to just echo what Jay said about the Great Lakes being 20% of the world's surface fresh water. I mean, it's really hard to put that in perspective, right? 20%, what does that mean? And I love this factoid that if you could pour the waters of the Great Lakes out over the lower 48 states, it would cover them. Not just, like an inch that you wade through, 9.5 feet of water. That's how much water is in the Great Lakes. And I don't think that's an insignificant fact when there's close to 1 billion people around the world that lack access to safe drinking water on a daily basis. So we're really blessed to have all the water here. Dan Egan's book really does cover a lot of the threats and challenges that we're facing the Great Lakes today. Aquatic invasive species, we're all familiar with the sea lamprey, the zebra mussel. Did you all know the Asian carp is knocking on the door of the Great Lakes in Chicago? Good, okay. A lot of pollution and runoff issues, and Lake Erie has really suffered from a lot of those. The blue-green algae blooms that shut down the drinking water source supply in Toledo for 3 days. Just a few years ago. That wasn't in the 1960s, it was 2014 when that happened. And then the issue of water diversion. So we have all this water here. What if there's a lot of communities out there that want that water? How do we make sure that we can retain that water here, keep it in the lakes where it's valuable? Personal story for you. Our family have 2 teenage boys. My wife and I took them on a trip to the Great Lakes this summer. We went up from Western New York, crossed into Canada, went up the Bruce Peninsula, took the ferry over to Manitoulin Island, went to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, back through Chicago. My 2 boys and I, my wife did not want to swim in Lake Superior, but my 2 boys and I swam in every one of the Great Lakes, plus the Georgian Bay. And my younger son wanted me to ask the audience, has anyone here swum in all 5 of the Great Lakes? No? Okay, well he will be very proud to hear that. And I was really struck when we were in Lake Superior, just how it really looks a lot like what this continent used to look like. I mean, there's just unbroken forests everywhere, intact shoreline. And I want to echo what Jay said about communities that are really recognizing their dependency on healthy Great Lakes. I think we really have, it's harder in the developed parts of the Great Lakes to really see how dependent we are on our healthy water supplies and healthy landscapes. But it's really true if you go to places like Munising, Michigan, and Manitoulin Island. But the good news is that I've seen a lot of cities now really starting to realize how their future is entwined with healthy Great Lakes. And I'm sure Jill's going to talk a lot about that and the blue economy concept. But if you look at Buffalo, look at the renaissance we're enjoying in Buffalo based on healthy waterfront, healthy waters. That's happening in Milwaukee, it's happening in Chicago, it's happening in Cleveland. So I think we are seeing that renaissance now of people realizing that healthy lakes and healthy waters are really the foundation of a healthy economy. Great to see that. And I will say too that our water really is a finite resource. I mean, it's when we think about standing in 9.5 feet of water in the lower 48 states, or 20% of the world's surface freshwater, it's easy to think that that resource is inexhaustible, but it is not. And there's some great stories. If you go to the Aral Sea in Asia, anyone heard the story of the Aral Sea? This was at one time, I think, the 8th or 9th largest lake in the world. This is in the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, in order to grow cotton, diverted a lot of the waters that feed the Aral Sea to agriculture. And within the time of a generation or so, the Aral Sea shrunk from about, well, I think it's about 10% of its volume now. So 90% of the volume of the Aral Sea is gone. It all went to grow cotton. So we need to take that threat seriously here in the Great Lakes. I want to tell you one story, and then I'll turn the mic over to Jill, about something that I'm really excited about that the Nature Conservancy is working on in the Great Lakes. And that is restoring the native fisheries of the Great Lakes. I think we're probably familiar with the story of the American bison, the buffalo. I mean, at one time there were 40 million bison that roamed the Great Plains. But by the 1890s, there were only a few hundred of them left. And you know, the settlement of the country, the expansion of the country, we basically took what was seen as an inexhaustible resource and we wiped it out. And sadly, the same story of us thinking of resources as inexhaustible has happened with our fisheries in the Great Lakes. The same tragic tale has happened right here. It's because I think we don't realize the impacts that we can have as humans. The earliest European settlers to the Great Lakes, they found a region that was really teeming with whitefish and lake trout, Atlantic salmon in Lake Ontario, blue pike in Lake Erie, but a combination of factors, overfishing, commercial overfishing, pollution, dams, and aquatic invasive species really decimated them to the point that they're really just shadows of their former selves. And what I think this hit, probably the hardest hit species has been whitefish and lake herring. These are the building blocks of the food web. They're the mid-level of the food web. They're not the top predators like lake trout and walleye. They're not the little tiny fish. Whitefish may be 20 inches, lake herring maybe a foot long. They're really so important to the health of the food web. They also were critical as a food source to humans in the 19th and 20th century. The staple fish fry that we enjoyed all around the Great Lakes was whitefish and lake herring. And actually, I will say that when I was at Lake Superior this summer, I enjoyed many a whitefish fish fry. Very tasty. I highly recommend them. So we're trying to turn that around. The Nature Conservancy believes that the key to restoring the native fisheries of the Great Lakes begins with restoring the food web, the building blocks of the food web. We're partnering with academia, state and federal agencies. We're trying to figure out what are the barriers to the success of these fish. How can we overcome those barriers, and how can we convert a lot of our hatcheries into restoring the native food web? And I think that will be something you'll be reading a lot more about. We've done that successfully in Lake Ontario, and we're now hoping to move into Lake Erie. So with that, I'll turn the mic over to Jill, but the last thing I'll say is, you know, this book, as Jay said, it's the death and life of the Great Lakes. I think if you read some of the case studies in here, it does paint a pretty pessimistic picture at times. But I think the last chapter and some of the case studies in here show that there is hope. And I feel we couldn't do our jobs if we didn't feel like at the end of the day we can see a bright future. And I do feel that it begins with making sure people are aware of the sense of urgency, and also that there are solutions and that we can solve these challenges that are in front of us. So looking forward to some more dialogue with everyone too.
Jim, you stole my first line. What am I going to do now? First of all, I want to thank each and every one of you who have taken time out of your personal schedules to be here and listen to the three of us today. It's really great to see that people are curious and interested and willing to take time to learn and participate in water issues. It's such a great thing for our community. I want to thank Frank and Mary Jean for inviting us to have us here today, the Buffalo and Erie County Library, a great system, an incredible resource for Western New York, and also my colleagues Jay and Jim, two of the people that I respect the most in the environmental field. And in case you didn't miss it, you have to have a name that starts with the letter J to be a leader. And mind you, at Waterkeeper, we have 13 of our 30 employees all have a name that starts with the letter J. That is it's not intentional. I mean, I'm just saying. Okay, so I have 10 minutes. I have so much more to say than in 10 minutes, but I'll do my best. I like to start out conversations by reminding folks that our water defined our history, and it'll also define our future here in Western New York. It's why we're here. Reading this book and reflecting on this book, and I did do my homework, so I'm going to reference some of the key takeaways of reading this book. There's three things that jump out in this book to me that resonates also here in Western New York. The theory about biological and DNA pollution. You know, that is a phrase and something that really struck home to me, because in our world, we talk the geeky water talk all the time and the techno lingo of invasive species and all the Latin names of these, but really to kind of drill down to speak human and to understand what this means. We are polluting our water systems with the biology of foreign invaders and other things that don't belong there. We've got the ballast water issues, we've got the alewife infestation, we've got Asian carp knocking on the door. And just this year, 2 new species have been listed. In a long time, we had gone maybe about 10 or 15 years, I think it was, in the Great Lakes where not an invasive species was identified. 2 new zooplankton or zooplankton species were identified this year, which is a little depressing. The second takeaway that I had really looks at how the built and living infrastructure systems in society in the Great Lakes are really wreaking the devastation and impairments in our systems. When you look at the core of a lot of the issues that are facing us, it's the dams, it's the locks, it's the alterations, it's the reversing of the Chicago River. You know, you're reversing an entire river system. Of course there's going to be ramifications to that. The draining of the Great Black Swamp in Ohio. We were talking on Monday when we met in preparation for this, and we all heard about the algal blooms in the western basin of Lake Erie, right? Those are happening because of what humans did. We drained the kidneys of Lake Erie. The Great Black Swamp used to filter nutrient runoff that would flow into the Great Lakes. You can't live without your kidneys. How can a water system live without its kidneys? It's the same thing. And then ultimately, the overarching issue is really, as a society over time, we've decided collectively that we are going to treat our water systems as a commodity. How can these systems exist for our benefit, our recreation, our drinking water? How can we bottle it up and sell it away to make more money? How can we leverage it as a commodity? The diversions, the waste disposal. We never really historically viewed the lakes as part of us. But when you do, in the very basics of it, we are alive because of Lake Erie. 75% of each and every one of you, well, yes, you drink a lot of Lake Ontario water, so maybe not you. 75% of your body is alive and here because of that lake, because of Lake Erie. We are connected to that water whether you like it or not. And we have to kind of shift that paradigm and shift that thinking. And those are some of the key things and key messages that I took from this book. And I actually learned a lot. You know, I've been in this field for 20 years. The lifelong learning that comes with the sciences and the natural environment, to be curious, to constantly ask questions, that's the scientific methodology. Don't just take something somebody says to you or writes in a meme on social media. Ask questions, be curious, research it, understand it. And that was some of the joy that I got out of reading this book. Because when you do look at these issues, and in our lives, in our professional lives, sometimes our work is very depressing. You can easily lose hope. I mean, we literally talk about human feces every day. My husband has forbidden me from talking about human feces at dinner, but it's something that happens. You know, we pollute our waterways on a daily basis. We do it willingly and knowingly. We have entire permitting systems that have been established to willingly and knowingly pollute the systems in which contribute to our lives and our health. And that's something that as a community, as a society, we need to start to shift away from. And there are examples of that happening. So the only criticism I would have of this book is that oftentimes when folks write about the Great Lakes, you always hear about Michigan and Wisconsin and the upper Great Lakes. And I use the Brady Bunch analogy of Michigan, Michigan, Michigan. That's all we ever hear about. You know, what about Lake Erie? You know, what about Lake Ontario? What about New York State? You know, the problem, and then you think about it, and again, it's in New York State and Western New York, we've forgotten how to be a Great Lakes community. So kudos to Michigan for building a whole economic strategy around pure Michigan and being connected to its waterways. New York State built its economy by building roads and hazardous waste dumps along its waterfront. Of course we weren't going to be connected both psychologically and physically to our waterways. But that's changing, and it's changing on the local level. Little factoid that you can take on a Friday night if you're going out tonight. New York State has over 570 miles of Great Lakes shoreline. That's a lot of shoreline. And over 47% of the state is in the Great Lakes watershed. We are a Great Lakes state. We're not just about New York City and the Atlantic coast. You know, we are a Great Lakes state. So we look at our own local history. We describe this, what we're going through right now, which is called a rust to blue transition. It's a cute little phrase, but it really, in those 3 words, it really describes what we've been through, where we're going, and where our future can be. So Buffalo, Detroit, Chicago, a lot of these areas in the Great Lakes, we built our economies around industry. Our industries, our workforces helped win world wars based on the production that's happening here. But after the end of the Second World War in the 1940s, these areas whose natural resources were sucked up, abused, and put into the military machine in order to save our democracy were left for dead. They were so polluted and left behind and our natural resources abused, we were left as a community holding the bag. And ultimately, locally, things hit rock bottom really in the 1960s, but you can track it back even to the 1940s. It would be easy, and it was easy for a lot of people to just pack up and leave. But there were many folks and generations of folks that stayed here in Western New York. This is our home. It's not just a place or a footnote in a book. It's our home. We live here. Our family histories are here. Some people know about my family history and my great uncle, Stan Spiesiak, who's known as Mr. Buffalo River. We all have ties here and links here. So there's no better place to start if you're concerned about the global environment than to take action on a local level. And that's the beauty of this community and what we've started to do in this Rust to Blue transition. Just this past week, has anybody read or saw the report of the Great Lakes Commission report about the economic impacts of environmental restoration? A few people. Okay, this is your homework after today. On Sunday, or I think it was Sunday's paper earlier this week, a front page headline talking about the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and how investments in environmental restoration are generating a 4-to-1 economic return. That is far greater than any other traditional economic development project. Most economic development projects will return you a 2-to-1 or 2.8-to-1. That's the average. But the investments in our environment are giving us a 4-to-1 return for the jobs, for the economic activity, for the quality of life improvements. It makes economic sense to put investments into restoring and reclaiming these water systems. Not to mention, it's good for our health and good for the environment. And that's kind of the basis of the concept of the blue economy. How do you invest into these water resources to stimulate economic growth, to revitalize communities, and be protective of the actual resource and not treat it as a commodity? That just takes a mental shift and a cultural paradigm shift, which we're starting to see. I forgot to introduce my organization, I'm sorry. I am the executive director of Buffalo Niagara Waterkeeper. We've been around for about 30 years. and have 30 professional staff. And some of our key priorities are to protect the quality and quantity of water and also increasing access to water. And I think water access is a critical thing and an issue that all three of us share, because access is more than just being able to walk down to the water's edge and look at it. And historically, that's been qualified as an improvement to our waterfront because we have access to our water. Well, we want to do more than just walking down to the edge and looking at it. We need to engage with that water. We want to put a line in to go fishing. We want to go on a tour. We want to paddle. We want to swim in our resource again someday and not worry that we're going to come home sick or with a rash. And so that is the true meaning of universal access, that every community, every person, regardless of where you live, where you're from, who your family is, what you look like, how much income you have. These are public trust resources that are shared equally amongst all of us, and we should continue to have that access. Am I okay? 5? Oh, I got 5 minutes still? Or am I done? Was that the stop sign?
It's 5 minutes.
Okay.
Wrap it up 5 minutes.
Wrap it up, okay. I'll wrap it up in 3. So, when we talk about the paradigm shift that we're seeing, it's been very interesting, even in my own career over the last 20 years. And you're probably saying, wow, she looks so young. She's been working for 20 years. It's been 20 years of just this type of work. And when you look at early on in my own career as an environmental professional, how hard it was just to start a conversation and be taken seriously about everything I just talked about. Access, valuing waterways more than a commodity, healthy environment. 20 years wasn't that long ago. And there's been an evolution, and I see it every day, and I'm sure both of you see it every day in your work, in how the general community and our elected officials and our community leaders are changing their own dialogue. I was at a press event last week where there was elected official after elected official standing at the podium talking about ecotourism, talking about water resources driving the economic recovery of this region. That's a victory. That is a victory for this region, that our leaders are starting to speak the same language as those environmentalists and as the community, which was easily dismissed many years ago, not that long ago. So I've seen this transition as an anecdotal story. Early on in my career, I was called a lot of things when I would show up to meetings. You know, tree hugger, fish lover, project killer, you know, obstructionist. At one point I was called an environmental libtard. I don't know what that means. An eco-terrorist. I'm just a Pollyanna, you know, a special interest group. It would have been so easy to just kind of walk away from that. And I think what really struck home, even just a couple of years ago, was overhearing a conversation asking why, you know, Waterkeeper is a great organization. Why is it run by a bunch of girls? Because my executive team is all women, and I'm a female leader. So, not to derail the whole environmental conversation, but it's that emphasis that we need to continue to shift the conversation and change the paradigm of who we think, how we think about our water resources, who the messengers are, and who really are the leaders in this community. And it starts with individual action. It starts with the nonprofits. It starts with the community leaders, because we make the change collectively. We've seen it happen over 20 years. We still have a little more way to, we have a lot more ways to go. But I would encourage you, be curious, keep speaking up, and be active. So this book could be seen as depressing, or it could be seen as something that is going to help motivate us to take action. So in our line of work, I've never been more motivated. I've never been more excited. I've never been more hopeful at a local level, seeing what is happening here in Western New York. Because for a community that was once rated as the 4th poorest city in the country and called the armpit of America and left for dead, we sure have done a heck of a lot of work as a community reclaiming our water and reclaiming our economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Give our panelists a wonderful hand. Do we have another? There's my microphone here, and we have a wireless microphone there. Do we have another one for for the questions. I'm gonna put it out to questions. Before I go any farther, and considering this may be the last one, I want to recognize on behalf of the library to the two people who do. I did it again. Two people who, as any good board chair, I stand up and take all of the credit and print my name on everything, but I do none of the work of putting these together. That is done by two people in the back, Ann Conable and Joy Testachinquino. They're the ones who put together the panel, do all the work to set it, to put it together, and I just stand here and take all of the credit. So could we just take a moment, since this is the last of it, give both of them a hand. Could you both stand up? So who has the first question?
Questions?
This gentleman?
The book mentions over and over again that the Great Lakes have a lot of species population booms and crashes. Part of this they accredit to that they were isolated for so many years, and then add to this the pollution and the invasive species. Is there anything we can do specifically about that? Is there anything that's been done in other isolated environments like Hawaii or places like that?
I'll take a stab at that one. Yes, I think the Great Lakes have really transitioned from a very stable food web, beginning back to the 19th century, to a very unstable collection of non-natives, some of which we've deliberately put into the lakes, some of which have arrived accidentally. I think that the way to resolve that is what we're trying to do with the building blocks of the food web. We can't start at the top. We can't say, well, we love to catch big fish, so let's get our big fish back in the watersheds. I think we have to start with thinking about the building blocks of the food web, and for us, that's the mid-level, which has been really affected by invasive species. I think you've all read about the zebra mussel, the quagga mussel. I mean, that has really driven some incredible change. These guys are about the size of your fingernail. They can filter about 1 liter of water every day. And there are billions of them in the Great Lakes, all arrived in the ballast water of ocean-going ships that entered the Great Lakes. Dan Egan in his book refers to them. We should think of those ships not as commercial vessels, but as syringes that we're injecting new species into our lakes. So I think A, we've got to stop the invasives coming in, but B, we've got to start working on how we can rebuild a more stable food web. It's never going to be what it once was. I don't think we should kid ourselves. There are changes, irrevocable changes that have happened, but we can restore some of the diversity and stability if we're pointing our systems in that way. I don't know if that answers your question. Anyone else want to take a shot at that?
Yes, it's a very complicated situation, obviously. So there's a lot of things. Even the chemistry of the waters has changed. Jill mentioned new microorganisms, new genetics. All of this stuff is combining to create crazy situations. We don't have nearly as many as the number of native species that we used to have. And when we repopulate them, they die off. We have a big issue right now in Niagara River with the emerald shiner. One of the things that's being talked about is climate change. We didn't talk much about climate change, but it's here, and it's going to continue to come here, and that's changing everything. So I think the answer is, we're working at it, but we really don't know what the solution is.
There are a couple of solutions. You talk about isolated systems, and you're absolutely right that for the most part, the Great Lakes does afford itself a lot of protections because of that. And this is where we get into sometimes the uncomfortable discussions about policy and regulation. Those aren't necessarily bad words when it comes to environmental protections. We need to have smart policies and smart regulations that are applied and enforced, and that way we can get a handle on maybe some preventions in slowing down the introductions of new species.
All right. Anyone else? Question?
Kind of got one. I'm just curious how you move forward with some of these things, because a lot of it is, I'm thinking of the people that live along shorelines, maybe along the Niagara River, and the ice dam blocks all the ice from going down there, so you can't just get rid of that. And so, but that has changed a lot. The dams that are up in the St. Lawrence, and you can't just, well, it would be nice if we could just get rid of them. but I mean, how do you provide financial compensations or a change in thinking so that, you know, there are jobs, the places that use the water for their factories, you know, people have jobs and they work there. And you can't just say, oh, you know, you're out of here. And it just, I'm trying to see how you move forward. How do you convince or change, you know, people so that they can still live and afford to get the power and all that.
Sure, I can take a stab at that. I think that there are success stories happening all over the Great Lakes right now that can give case studies and examples of how change is happening. There's no magic wand and there's no cookie cutter solution depending on the community. But we do see how I say the paradigm shift, just how the thinking is in community planning and designing with nature. So for many, many years, the theory of engineering, the principles of engineering are how do you command and control a natural system. Now we're actually seeing engineers and environmental engineering of how do you replicate a natural system so it is protective of human infrastructure and human lives, but also will do less harm or do no harm to the environment. So we're starting to see a shift in that direction. It's going to take some time, but at least that's one example I can give on that. Do either of you have an answer?
I just want to talk about the way that we look at economic development. And one of the problems that we have with our current economic system is that we value profit over consequences. And so, for instance, in contemporary economics, there's something called externalities. And so if you measure, for instance, taking down a forest, you look at the value of the lumber. You don't look at the consequences of the impacts on the environment. And I think that that's a cultural shift that we've yet to jump into, but we're working there. But that will affect all of our lives. It'll make a difference in how we think about things and how we do things. We all need jobs, we all need money, we all need to find ways to contribute and be part of the economy. We've got some work ahead of us.
I think you're talking about pretty significant change in our systems to achieve the types of goals the types of objectives that we need. And to me, as we think about systems level change, it's about unprecedented collaboration, working with diverse stakeholders. We have to find common ground. Very difficult in today's very divisive environment, I'll say, political environment. It also requires evidence. I mean, we need to have evidence-based solutions. We need to be trying different things. We need to be innovating. I will say that I think there's a great example of a big win in the Great Lakes here in New York. Just a couple years ago, you referenced the dam on the St. Lawrence. Are you all familiar with what's called Plan 2014? It's a new operating plan for the dam on the St. Lawrence River. So I don't think we're ever going to remove that dam. I don't think there's too many societal benefits that it generates. It did have some serious negative consequences though. But I give a lot of credit to the US and Canadian governments. They recognized the negative consequences of that dam, the impacts that it had on the health of the lake. They invested in a study to look at other opportunities, other options for managing that dam differently. And they engaged in years of stakeholder engagement to try to figure out, okay, what are some balanced plans that we can operate this dam from that everyone wins. And in 2016, at the end of 2016, that new plan was put in place. And it will restore the health of the lake while respecting all the other interests, hydropower, shoreline property, shipping, recreation. You know, there are some people that don't make out the way, the stakeholders that made out the way they did previously, but they're still winners overall. And I think those are the types of solutions we need to find and the types of processes we need to be committing to get systems level change.
I'm particularly thinking of the mussels as an invasive species, and if you look upon them as something that could be targeted by a drug that is non-toxic to other, you know, would not affect the water, but could kill these species. Is that something that is being looked at, or is that just too far off in the future?
I think both zebra mussels and quagga mussels have been undergoing a lot of research by many institutions. The problem is that the mussels themselves are, at one point, I think some of the last data I saw, covering 80% of the bottom of Lake Erie. 80%, that's huge. So even if there was a chemical control, the volume that would be needed to do that may itself, cause some, you don't want to cause unintended consequences. So we've got to be very careful whether you're looking at chemical control or another biological control, which is something that we were talking about earlier this week as well, about just like as in the success story of the purple loosestrife plant we're talking about, where a beetle was brought in and released to control that population. That's a success story. But the whole story about Asian carp to begin with is Asian carp were brought in to compete on weeds and then had the unintended consequence. So there's a lot of more research that has to happen on that.
Just take that too. The other thing I will mention, there's a great chapter in here on whitefish recovery. I think it's in Lake Michigan. Michigan. But there's a great story about how the whitefish in Lake Michigan are starting to come back because they are starting to eat zebra and quagga mussels. They've adapted, their intestines are totally changing in order to evolve to eat zebra mussels. So I think the system, we need to give nature some credit. Nature can adapt and adjust if we let it, but we've got to count on nature. We've got to give nature that chance.
So I'm not quite done with the book. So I'm in the part with all the invasive species, and it is frightening. And but I think it sheds light on how everything's all interconnected. We really have to think this all the way through. But what gives me hope is how I think the context of conversations continues to evolve. So in the early 80s, during my college years, going to school for business administration, the focus, if you look at the triple bottom line, there was really one P that had focus, and that was the profit piece of it. And then several years later, the people, the HR, the employee engagement piece kind of got added to that. And recently, the planet conversation as well. But what I think is really interesting is we're now starting to see the triple bottom line evolve from people, planet, profit to people, planet, prosperity. And I think when you look at that final P as prosperity in general, not just the profit piece of it, it takes into account a lot of the intangibles that are really hard to measure from a traditional profit standpoint. So I think that gives us some hope.
I like what you're talking about. I like the triple bottom line. That's important stuff. Now, I want to say a little bit more about the externalities that I was mentioning earlier, where you measure the profit and you don't measure the consequences. One of the ways that we don't think about the consequences is obviously the environment. There's also social consequences. So the way our system works, it focuses on the profit, not the triple bottom line, but the profit. And the consequences are kind of socialized. So we live in a socialist system where we're always paying with our health, with our cultural, what's the word, instability. And so, I mean, the economic angle to the way we move ahead, the way we thrive, the way we survive, we have to have some serious paradigm changes.
Anyone else? Yes, ma'am.
I would just like to thank the three of you. I've spent some time, I don't know how to operate this.
Speak directly to it.
You don't have to do anything, just talk. Okay, I can start. I've been volunteering with Waterkeeper for a while now, and I really enjoy that. I've been, hiking in some of the areas that Conservancy is really, and doing some time down at Times Beach. And, the more we as a community can take ownership of what you all are working on, I think that's so important, because people are much more excited than they used to be. Sometimes they say, where did you go? And I tell them, really, it's not like that anymore. People are really interested. And I think that's critical. I really do. That'll keep things going. It's also, you're getting wonderful publicity. I think the Buffalo News has been doing a really good job about kind of keeping things current. So, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, too. And I just want to say we need your help. I don't want to be too Clinton-ish, but it takes a village. And so we need everybody to be involved. This is a good day to be talking about Clinton, I think. We need to be supporting that point of view. But thank you, too.
I'm going to ask the last question. If we have time, we'll go back to the gentleman in the back. For me, the book was deeply disturbing, and another P would be politics. I mean, we're seeing what can only be described as open contempt by a lot of political structures for the environment. We see this in Flint, Michigan. We see this in orders by the president to reverse fundamental environmental protections, so much so that for really no reason at all other than ideological contempt for the natural world, people are now allowed to go and murder bear cubs in hibernation. So, you know, and from, you know, what we saw yesterday, just simply abandoning any pretense of investigation to get a political result. We have a lot of work to do to get to the point where we work from the bottom up to get, you know, the political solutions. And so I guess my question for the panel is, in that context, what's something that all of us can do to try to improve the Great Lakes?
Jake threw the microphone at me. Well, I think, sorry. It's a complex answer. But the one thing that I can say, and I've been honored through my work to be able to travel to Washington, D.C. And walk the halls of both the Senate and Congress and meet with leaders in many administrations. And I can honestly tell you that of all the regions in the country and of all the issues facing us as a society, the Great Lakes is something that is unifying, and it is bipartisan support. As an environmental nonprofit, sometimes you get labels attached to you that you may be, you know, one direction, sway one direction versus another. We work very hard to be apolitical because these are resources that we all share. And if we don't have everybody rowing in the same direction on both sides of the aisle, then we're just going to be spinning in circles. And we can't afford that in our lifetimes and on these issues. So through my organization and the work of our team, we will continue to work with all folks from all sorts of political backgrounds, as long as we have shared goals on the issues at hand.
That's great. I would echo that. I would also add, drink Great Lakes water. Don't drink bottled water. We have fantastic water here. I would add, there's a great quote from an author named Wendell Berry, and it's, let's see if I can remember this. Let me skip that. I'll come back to it. The other thing I was going to say is join conservation organizations, be members, support them, support Waterkeeper, support Friends of Times Beach, support the Nature Conservancy. That's great. And then the quote, I think I've got it. It's how you eat, for the most part, determines how the world is used. So think carefully about the choices you make when you eat locally, try to eat sustainably. I love the Michael Pollan book. Mostly eat vegetables, not processed food, and don't eat a lot of calories either. So I would urge you to think about your dietary choices too.
Don't give up. I mean, that's a philosophical thing, but it's really easy in these days to be depressed and thinking, what the hell? I mean, you know, daily life is kind of a challenge. On a personal philosophical note, I think this is a great time to be alive. I think it's a great time to be a human. I mean, I might be going against the grain of history with that, but every day I wake up and I think, wow, it's another day. It's you know, I can do stuff today. And by mid-morning, I'm getting kind of tired. And by later in the morning, I'm depressed. And by mid-afternoon, I want to go shopping and buy some stuff and get rid of my depression. Then, you know, I go to bed and wake up again every day. So don't give up.
All right. Yeah, and one thing we discussed when we met previously is, can anybody tell me the name of the president who signed the Clean Water Act? Richard Nixon. So the degradation of the environment it's a political process. It's not one party or the other. Some of the best things have been done by Republicans, and some of the worst things have been done by Democrats. I know I took a shot yesterday. Anyone else? Did you want to ask your question, sir? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So just thinking about like a hopeful future. I'm a parent of 3 young elementary school students, and as a school parent, a lot of what we hear is push for more of a STEM curriculum, hands-on learning, get outside the classroom. So I guess with you guys in your organizations, do you ever spend a lot of time thinking about ways you could maybe meet that need for schools, but also help engage the younger generation?
Oh, yeah.
More?
Well, STEM and curriculum and kids and learning are a big part of all the work that we do. And we're always engaging kids. We're always engaging school systems, whether they're private or public or colleges. So yes, absolutely, STEM is a huge part of that. And it's come on the scene in recent years, and it's kind of lit up a lot of our ability to talk about this stuff and work towards solutions.
Yeah, we have a curriculum called Nature Works Everywhere that we're working with a number of school districts around the country with. We also have a program called our LEAF program, where we're engaging with urban districts from predominantly underserved communities, trying to get kids out into nature. Many kids from a lot of urban areas just really haven't been out in nature. They haven't seen a raccoon or a squirrel, maybe a squirrel. But we're trying to get them out so they can experience nature. And 30% of the kids that go through that program end up in environmental careers. So we're pleased with that.
That's great.
At Waterkeeper, we do have something we call our YELP program, which is our Young Environmental Leaders. We actually work with middle and high school students, and we actually then have intensive mentorship over the summer. We're looking to grow that program, and one of our big ambitions is actually to establish a waterways center. I don't know if many of you have seen us talking about that as a really a permanent hub and a home for the Great Lakes and water identity in Western New York, where we would encourage youth and adult education, which is just as much. So we are definitely thinking about the next generation. Best thing I can say in addition to the STEM, throw your kids outside. Get them outside and play. I am who I am today because I used to play in the mud and catch toads and rock hop and try to catch tadpoles. God help me, my parents wanted me to be an accountant. Thank God that didn't happen. But it's that experience. It's get your feet wet and your hands dirty.
Thanks to our panel. Thank you to all of you.